The crowbar found the letter before Elias Marsh found the strength to open it. He had been prying loose the water-stained paneling in the old lighthouse stairwell since dawn, chasing the smell of mildew back to its source, when a section of wood gave way with a groan, and something pale slipped out and landed face down on the dusty steps. For a moment he thought it was a dead moth. The paper had gone that thin and gray. Then he turned it over and saw his own handwriting, 22 years younger than the hands that now held it. "Julian," it began, "by the time you read this, I'll already be gone from your life," which I suppose is a strange thing to write to someone you love. Elias sat down hard on the stairs, the way a man sits when his knees have quietly voted without him. He had written this letter the summer he was 23. He remembered folding it into a square small enough to hide, remembered the particular ache of sliding it into the knothole the town had called the keeper's ear for 100 years, the place where lighthouse keepers once left messages for sailors who might never come home, and where lovesick teenagers later left messages for each other, half believing the wall itself might carry the words where courage could not. He had told himself, for 20 years, that Julian had read it. That Julian had read it and simply chosen silence. Now, holding the letter that had never left the wall at all, Elias understood he had spent 2 decades grieving a rejection that had never happened. Outside, gulls wheeled over Anchor Bay, indifferent to the small earthquake taking place in a dead woman's guest house. Elias's Aunt Corinne had left him this crooked, salt-bitten in 8 months ago, along with her cat, her debts, and, apparently, this. He did not open the letter fully. Not yet. He folded it back along its ancient creases, the way you'd fold a wound closed, and carried it upstairs to the desk in his aunt's old office, where a manila folder from the Anchor Bay Historical Preservation Society was waiting, unopened, with a name typed neatly on the assignment sheet inside. Lead Restoration Architect, Julian Reyes. Elias read it 3 times before his hands stopped shaking enough to set it down. 2 weeks earlier, none of this had seemed possible. Elias Marsh was 39 years old, ran a guest house nobody could quite afford to fix, and had built a life so quiet it barely made a sound. He opened the Lantern House's 4 guest rooms to sailboat tourists in summer, closed them to everyone but the wind in winter, and spent his evenings repairing what money couldn't reach. Rerouting tile, resetting hinges, listening to the building settle around him like an old dog easing onto a porch. He had loved exactly one person in his life the way people love in songs. That had ended when he was 23, and he had built every year since out of smaller, safer affections, friendships, a business, a cat named Compass who tolerated him. The preservation grant had felt like a lifeline and a threat in equal measure. The state would pay to restore the lighthouse keeper's stairwell and the widow's walk if, and only if, Elias let their architect document, alter, and effectively rebuild the parts of the house that held his whole life inside their walls. He had said yes anyway, because the roof was failing and love does not pay for roofing. He had not asked who the architect would be. He had assumed, in the unthinking way people assume the past stays past, that it would be a stranger. Julian Reyes stepped out of a rented car in the gravel drive of the Lantern House at 4 in the afternoon, and Anchor Bay tilted very slightly on its axis. He was 40 years old now, silver threading through dark hair that used to fall stubbornly over one eye, wearing the kind of unshowy good coat that suggested a life built carefully, plank by plank, somewhere far from the sea. He had a folder of blueprints under one arm and the particular stillness of a man who has trained himself not to flinch in front of clients. He flinched anyway when Elias opened the front door. "You," Julian said, and it wasn't a greeting. It was closer to a diagnosis. "Me," Elias agreed, because after 20 years, it was the only word he trusted himself to say correctly. They stood in the doorway long enough for the moment to become its own small architecture, a structure neither of them had blueprints for. Then Julian did what careful men do when the ground shifts. He became very professional. "I didn't know you owned the property," he said, opening his folder like a shield. The assignment sheet listed the owner as C. Marsh. "Corinne," Elias said. "My aunt. She passed in the fall." Something in Julian's face softened, briefly, at the mention of a woman who used to feed him blueberry pie on the porch and call him the architect's son years before he became one. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it, and then straightened his shoulders like a man resetting a level. "I can request a reassignment." If you'd rather not. Elias thought of the letter folded in his aunt's desk drawer upstairs, the one that had waited 20 years in a wall for exactly one reader. No, he said. Stay? He did not know, yet, that it was the same word he had wanted to say to Julian once before and had never gotten the chance. They worked around each other for 3 days like two people crossing a frozen pond, testing each step before trusting it. Julian measured joists and photographed water damage. Elias carried his coffee, his silences, his questions he didn't ask. In the evenings they sat at opposite ends of the long porch, and something old and stubborn kept trying to grow back in the space between their chairs, like grass through a crack no one had sealed properly. On the 4th day, Julian found the knothole. He was documenting the stairwell paneling, the same paneling Elias had already opened, when his fingers found the worn, smooth edges of the keeper's ear, polished soft by decades of hands that had trusted a wall with what they couldn't say aloud. I remember this, Julian said quietly, and something in his voice had gone 18 years old again. Your aunt told us the story. Keepers used to leave messages here for the ones lost at sea, so the sea would know someone was still waiting. You left me a note here once, Elias said, before he could stop himself. The summer we were 17. It just said meet me at the point, bring the bad poetry. Julian huffed something that wasn't quite a laugh. I can't believe you remember that. I remember all of it, Elias said, and the porch light caught something unguarded in his face before he turned it away toward the sea. Julian's hand stayed on the knothole a moment too long, the way a hand lingers on a door it isn't sure it's allowed to open. Neither of them mentioned the letter Elias had already found. Not yet. Some truths, Elias had learned, need the right weather to be spoken. And that night, out past the point, the weather was already changing. The storm came in fast off the water, the way Anchor Bay storms always did. No patience, no warning, just a sudden violence of wind that rattled the guest house shutters like something trying to get in. Julian had been staying at the town in 3 miles down the coast road, but the road flooded before he could leave, and so he stood dripping in Elias's front hall at 9 at night, with a laptop bag held over his head like a poor umbrella, looking 20 years younger and considerably more surprised by his own life. You'll take the blue room, Elias said, already moving for towels, already terrified of how easily his hands remembered this, taking care of Julian Reyes. They ate soup standing at the kitchen counter because neither of them trusted a table, with its long silences and its face-to-face honesty. The power flickered once, twice, and finally surrendered, dropping the kitchen into candlelight the way the whole house used to look 20 summers ago, before either of them owned anything, before either of them had learned how to leave. Why didn't you write back? Elias asked. The candle flame did not so much as flicker at the question, though the whole kitchen seemed to hold its breath. Julian went very still. Write back to what? The letter, Elias said. I know you probably don't even remember it now. It doesn't matter. I used to wonder for a long time what I did that made you go quiet instead of angry. Angry I could have understood. Elias. Julian set down his spoon like it had suddenly gotten heavy. I never got a letter from you. I got the opposite. 2 weeks after I left for my father's posting overseas, I got a letter in your handwriting telling me not to write again, telling me you'd met someone else. I read it so many times the ink smudged. The candle between them did flicker now, as if the house itself had leaned in to listen. I never wrote that, Elias said. I know your handwriting, Eli. I spent 3 summers learning it. So did I, Elias said. And I never wrote a single word telling you to stop. Outside, the storm threw itself against the shutters like it, too, wanted answers. 20 years earlier, they had met the way summer things meet, without warning, without a plan for winter. Julian's family rented the house on the point every June. His father a rising state senator who liked the optics of a modest coastal cabin more than the cabin itself. Elias's family had lived in Anchor Bay for 4 generations, sons who became lobstermen or carpenters, or, in Elias's case, a quiet boy who preferred books to boats and was teased gently for it by everyone except the senator's son, who turned up one afternoon at the town library and asked, with unbearable seriousness, whether Elias could recommend something that wouldn't make him feel stupid. Elias had recommended everything. Julian had read all of it and come back for more, and somewhere between the 3rd book and the first bonfire, recommending things had turned into something neither of them had a name for yet. 3 summers. Long walks along the tide flats at low water. Comfortable silences that said more than either of them could manage out loud. The particular electricity of hands not quite touching on a porch rail. Their first kiss happened at 17, in the lighthouse stairwell, in a storm not unlike this one. Both of them laughing afterward out of sheer disbelieving joy. Their goodbye happened at 19, in September, on a dock, with none of that joy left in it at all. Julian's father had found out, not through any confession, but through the ordinary cruelty of a photograph taken by someone who meant harm. He had not shouted. Senators rarely do. They negotiate instead. He gave Julian a choice with only one real answer inside it. End this quietly, or watch what happens to a boy from a fishing family when a senator decides to make an example of him. Julian had chosen the only way he could see to protect Elias. Silence, distance, and a story his father fed him in a sealed envelope 2 weeks later, forged in ink that looked, cruelly, close enough to Elias's own hand to be believed by a heartbroken 19-year-old 3,000 miles from home. Elias, waiting on the same dock, had received no explanation at all, only Julian's sudden absence, and a silence he filled, over 20 years, with the worst story he could imagine about himself. Both of them had spent 2 decades grieving a version of events that had never actually happened. The morning after the storm broke gold and rinsed clean, the way Anchor Bay always apologizes for its own violence. Elias brought Julian the letter before his courage could talk him out of it. He set it on the kitchen table between 2 mugs of coffee, like something that might still be dangerous. "I found this in the stairwell," he said, "before you arrived. It's mine. I wrote it the week after you left, and I put it in the keeper's ear, and I never told a single person it existed. It never went anywhere. It's been in that wall for 20 years. Julian's hand hovered over it. "You're saying you never sent it." "I'm saying it was never sent. Not by the postal service, anyway." Elias's mouth curved, barely. "I think some part of me believed the wall, the way we used to. That leaving it there was its own kind of sending." Julian opened it with the careful reverence of a man handling something excavated from a shipwreck. He read in silence, and Elias watched 20 years cross his face like weather, grief, then disbelief, then something that looked almost like relief, the specific relief of a man finally being told he had not, in fact, imagined the best thing that ever happened to him. "Julian," the letter read, in the handwriting of a boy who did not yet know how long an ocean of silence could last. "By the time you read this, I'll already be gone from your life, which I suppose is a strange thing to write to someone you love. I'm not writing to say goodbye. I'm writing because I don't know how to stop loving you quietly, and I thought if I put it somewhere true, it might stop living only inside me. I don't know what your father said to you, or what he'll do to us, but I know this. Whatever silence comes next isn't because I stopped. It never will be. Come find me when it's safe. I'll still be here. I'm always going to still be here." Julian set the letter down and pressed the heel of his hand briefly against his eyes. 20 years, he said. Both of us waiting on the same dock, believing the wrong story. Both of us, Elias agreed, still here. They drove out to the point that afternoon, not because the site needed surveying, but because some conversations only make sense with the ocean listening. "He died 4 years ago," Julian said of his father, watching the tide pull back over the flats. "I found the drafts of that fake letter in his files afterward. He'd kept a copy. I think some part of him wanted me to find it eventually, some cowardly kind of confession. I didn't understand it until right now. I thought I was grieving a man who'd been strict. I didn't realize I was grieving 20 years he'd stolen from me on purpose. I spent those years thinking I wasn't enough to be worth an explanation," Elias said. "That's the version of me your father built. It's strange, meeting him for the first time now, 20 years too late to be angry at him properly." "You can be angry at him through me," Julian offered, with the ghost of the dry humor Elias remembered loving before he had a word for love. "I've got plenty left over." They laughed, a real laugh, startled out of both of them. The first one they'd shared since Julian's car pulled into the gravel drive. "I'm not asking you to forgive 20 years in an afternoon," Julian said, quieter now. "I know I have to earn back the right to stand this close to you. I just don't want to keep standing on the wrong side of another wall while I do it." Elias reached over, slow enough that Julian could step back if he needed to, and did not step back, and took his hand instead, the first deliberate touch in 20 years, warm and uncertain and entirely, finally, real. Then don't stand on the wrong side, Elias said. Stand here. The restoration went on, as restorations do, in small, unglamorous stages. New joists, resealed windows, a widow's walk finally safe enough to stand on. But something else was being restored too, slower and more carefully than any beam or hinge. Two men relearning how to trust a silence that used to be comfortable and had spent 20 years curdling into something else. It happened, in the end, exactly where it had happened the first time. The lighthouse stairwell, a storm gentling itself outside instead of raging. Both of them older, both of them steadier. Both of them entirely sure this time, in a way 17-year-olds cannot be. I used to think, Julian said, close enough now that his voice barely needed to travel, that if I ever came back here, it would only be to grieve what we didn't get to have. And now? Now I think, Julian said, we get to have it anyway. Just 20 years later than we planned. The kiss that followed was not the frantic, disbelieving joy of 17. It was slower, deliberate, the kind of kiss that has already decided to stay. Outside, the last of the storm gave way to a sky rinsed clean and startlingly blue, as if even the weather had been waiting for this particular ending. 1 year later, the Lantern House reopened in June with new shutters, a repaired widow's walk, and a small brass plaque by the front door reading, simply Est. 4 generations, restored by 2. The keeper's ear stayed exactly where it had always been, its edges worn soft by a century of hands trusting a wall with what they couldn't say aloud. Elias and Julian added one more thing to it before the last panel went back up. Not a goodbye this time, but a letter written together, sealed, and slid into the dark with the particular calm of two people no longer afraid of silence. It read, in 2 handwritings instead of 1, to whoever finds this, love is worth the wait, even the 20-year kind. Especially that kind. If you're reading this because you're waiting on someone, don't stop. Some letters take a while to arrive. They arrive anyway. They sealed the panel, and the sea outside kept doing what it always does, keeping time, keeping watch, keeping every promise anyone had ever left in its keeping, however long it took to deliver.